Hi, Bill Vales here. I'm here today with Jim Coull. Jim is a Littleton resident and is here to talk with us about the American chestnut tree. Jim is involved with the restoration of the American chestnut tree. Hi, Jim. It's great you could join us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Jim, can you tell us about the American chestnut tree? Why is it important to our history, our economy, and our way of life?
Well, the chestnut is one of the ancient trees in the Northeast and in the Appalachian Forest. As a matter of fact, going back to from the time the glaciers left, it went from tundra to softwoods to ultimately chestnuts and other hardwoods. And the chestnut tree at one time was 25% of the Appalachian Forest from Maine to Alabama. It was a giant tree. It grew prodigious rate, over 100 feet tall. It had 12-foot diameter girth. It was a great tree. It was very rot resistant. The wood was rot resistant. It was used for furniture, telephone poles, for railroad ties, gun stocks. Just a great wood, and it produced a prodigious amount of nuts, which were consumed by humans and animals. And very, very tragic loss of that tree, frankly.
So 25% of the trees in the Appalachian Forest,
Yes.
That would have to translate to billions.
Billions.
Billions
That's
of
correct.
trees.
That's correct.
Literally. What happened to them?
Well, back in the American chestnut is a giant tree, and it grows very fast. It'll grow. It'll take a chestnut 20 years to grow to the height that it takes an oak to grow in 50 years, so it grows very quickly. Back in the late 1800s, somebody decided to bring oriental chestnut trees to the United States. Now, the Chinese chestnut, the Japanese chestnut, the Korean chestnut are what are called orchard trees. They rarely get above 50 feet. They have a kind of a ball shape, and they're much more attractive for a landscaper, for example, than the American chestnut. The problem is they brought a blight with them. It's a fungus. It's called the Chestnut Blight. It was unleashed on the American chestnut, which had zero resistance to it. And they first noticed at the Brooklyn Arboretum in 1904 that all the American chestnuts were dying. And they discovered that the chestnuts had this blight. And what it basically does, it goes through any opening in the bark, grows in the cambium, and completely, which is the area around the bark where the sap flows to the tree and photosynthesis occurs, and it girdles the tree and the tree dies.
Now, was the chestnut tree only in the Appalachian areas? Or
Yes,
were
it was
an
eastern giant. The sequoia of the east is what it was called. And today, pioneers took American chestnut nuts out to Oregon. And the only true American chestnuts left are some orchards that are out there. They're giant trees. The blight never crossed the Rockies. In New Salem, Wisconsin, there's another orchard that was planted by a pioneer. And up until, I think, the early 2000s, it was blight-free, but the blight finally got there. So
It did?
It did, yeah.
Oh, that's
it
too
is.
bad.
It's very unfortunate.
So when you say the pioneers brought them out to Oregon, about how far back are you going there?
Well, it'd be back in the 1850s, the period of the Oregon
1850s.
Trail, when the great migration was going westward, and they took the nuts with them because they knew this is a great tree to have in your, as a resource. So.
Jim, I know that you're very active in a restoration project for the American chestnut tree. Can you tell us about the group that you're active with and
It's
what
the
you're
American
doing?
Chestnut Foundation, TACF.org. It has been doing what we call back crosses, where you start with a Chinese chestnut and American chestnut, because the Chinese is blight resistant. You cross them, that's the F1, and you back cross that. You continue to back cross, and it takes about 8 to 10 years for a complete back cross. So we're currently in the 4th back cross, which is the tree, and what happens is they do the back crosses, they plant them, and they infect the trees with the blight. And those that survive, they continue to back cross. The ones that don't survive, they cut them down, rogue them out. So what we're doing is basically breeding in the genetic markers of the disease, the blight resistance into the American chestnut. It will not be called the American chestnut when it is planted again. It's going to be called the restoration chestnut.
I see.
Because it's not a pure American. It's 96% American and 4% Chinese.
I see. And from reading about this, you go through 4 back crosses,
Yes,
is
yeah.
that correct?
That's correct.
So when I was reading about that, I said, why not 5 or more? What?
Well, you can continue to do it. The intent of the 4th back cross is to go into open forest plantings and see how the tree survives. A, does the blight morph itself into another form that kills it, for example? How does it do competing with other trees in the forest? I mean, open forest planting means that you got to protect them from deer for a little while, but then how does it do competing with pine and oak and hemlock or whatever?
With that number of trees, of American chestnut trees that were in the Appalachian forest, was there a negative aspect to not having diversity because there were so many chestnut trees?
Well, there was a whole business culture that grew up around this tree. I mean, it's a highly rot resistant because it's got a lot of tannin, and most of the leather tanneries in the early century in this country and before used the bark of the American chestnut as a source for tannin, for tanning leather.
Yes.
As I said, there were whole industries, and Pennsylvania had the greatest pandemic when the tree went, because there was a whole range of industries making telephone poles, railroad ties, gun stocks, furniture, you name it. It's a beautiful wood, and when it happened, it was frightening. I mean, they really, a whole group of people lost their livelihood.
Now, are all the American chestnut wiped out, or are there still?
Well, there were survivors, and you know, one of the projects recently was to put people on the Appalachian Trail to make markers of locations of American chestnut. The whole group of them were trained to look for the chestnut trees. And the obvious intent was to find trees that survived the blight.
I see.
And use those trees as mother trees for more blight resistance.
If we were lucky enough to be hiking the Appalachian Trail, and even more fortunate to run across an American chestnut, what would it look like? Can you talk about the morphology of the tree?
It would be likely. One of the things about the chestnut when it died, the roots stayed strong, and it root sprouts. And what you would probably find would be a root sprout that maybe had gotten to 6 or 8 inches in diameter, and then the blight got it, and more sprouts came up. So it would be highly unlikely you would find a large chestnut tree. Although I will tell you that when I became interested in this in 1992 when I read an article in National Geographic, and I said, I've got one of those trees on my property. And lo and behold, I had 3 on my property that had gotten up to 70 feet in height. Wow. They were probably somewhere in the range of 12 inches in diameter, and they were dropping nuts. And I went down in the early morning in October and late September, October, and got the nuts before the chipmunks did. Planted them, and I have pure American chestnuts in my yard.
Wow.
That I planted.
Wow.
Those 3 trees died, unfortunately. The blight got them. So
I've looked at some old photographs of the American chestnut tree, and to say they are impressive in size is really an understatement. I mean, diameters of 3 meters,
Oh, yeah.
Better part of 10 feet is just
common.
I mean, huge.
The other remarkable thing about the American chestnut, and the reason that it dominated the forest, is it blooms in June, well past frost, where the oak, on the other hand, can be frostbitten in May. So what it does basically is produces prodigious amounts of nuts. The burrs open the end of September, beginning of October. The minimum number of nuts in a burr is 2. There are thousands of them on the tree, so more common is 3 nuts. And when you've got 3,000 nuts on the ground, the deer can't consume them. You can't. The squirrels can't eat them all.
I see.
And what happens basically is the squirrels will bury some. There's your next generation of nuts.
See.
Or they just lay under the leaf litter, and in the spring they come up.
Now, I remember when I was first talking to you, I was recalling what I thought was an American chestnut tree in my youth, and you said, no, that was
That's the Ohio Buckeye.
Okay.
A very different tree, completely different species, but everybody says, they call it horse chestnut. That's the reason it became identified with the chestnut. But the chestnut itself, the American chestnut nut, is about the size of the end of your thumb. The nuts that you see in the streets at Christmas time are European nuts harvested in France or Italy, and they're much bigger, much more mealy, and the American chestnut's a sweeter nut.
So when the chestnut blight occurred, how old were some of the trees that were lost to the blight?
Oh boy, probably the oldest would be about 150 years. So they were old trees.
Okay.
Yeah, and they were huge trees.
How would the age of those trees be determined?
Well, the foresters today use an insert into the tree, and then they count the rings. And what they do is they look at historic events that determine the age of the tree, because there were periods when you had drought, the rings would be very narrow. There were periods when they had great growing, those would be large. And they know from history exactly how old that tree would be.
So in terms of counting rings, you don't need to cut the tree down and count the rings?
No, you don't.
Okay, you can take a boring?
That's correct.
Okay, and count the rings that way. Interesting. How far back does the American chestnut species go in time?
It's a very early tree, according to the information I have from TACF. It's an ancient tree in the eastern forest.
And are we talking thousands of years back?
Well, now you're getting me off my real knowledge, but I mean, yes. We're talking about shortly after the glaciers went away, and we went from tundra to forest, and it became largely softwoods, and then gradually the hardwoods took over.
Okay. So I imagine doing pollen samples and corings.
Yeah, they know exactly how long ago it was.
They can determine that. So I understand, and I've seen it, that there's a American chestnut restoration project right here in Littleton.
That's correct.
Can you tell us about that?
I was a member of the New England Forestry Foundation on the board of directors for 7 years. They were on King Street and Foster Street.
The Prouty Woods, right? And I asked if it would be possible to use some of the open fields to start a chestnut orchard. And we had third backcross nuts, and they said yes. We did a test planting. The test trees did very well, so now I have about 165 third backcross American chestnut there. We're going to inoculate them with the blight. Those that survive will continue to be bred. The ones that don't will be gone. Now, when you inoculate them with the blight, how long does it take to determine if they survived or not?
Within a year, you know that they. In fact, it's within a matter of months, you know.
Really?
Yeah. Well, there's two strains of the blight. One is extremely aggressive, and the other is less so. So the tree that survives the more aggressive inoculation are the trees that we really want.
Well, Jim, here we are at the New England Forestry Foundation Chestnut Orchard.
Yes, indeed.
It's absolutely beautiful
It is.
here.
It is.
Show us what you have.
All right. Well, this particular tree is a pure American chestnut. This is one of the control trees that we planted in the orchard. The majority of the trees, as I'd spoken about before, are third back cross. But these are pure Americans, and one of the interesting things is, as I said, the American chestnut blooms beyond frost in June, and it's open pollination. You have to have, these trees are not asexual, you have to have 2 trees or more for them to cross-pollinate. But I thought I'd show you something very interesting, because this is the actual male flower, and right here are the female burrs, and these are what produce the nuts. And if you notice on the end of the burr, there's a little white tips, little white prongs.
Yes.
What happens is the pollen from another tree lands on that, and that's what produces the nuts.
I see. And that needs to be from another tree.
It needs to be from another tree.
Okay.
As I said, they're not asexual. And the other interesting thing about it is each one of these burrs, and if you look around, you'll see that there are 5 or 6 on all of the ends of these limbs, produce a minimum of 2 and almost always 3.
Okay.
So it's a very prolific tree, and they'll be all over the ground, and what will happen, of course, is the squirrels and the chipmunks bury them, eat them. They can't consume them all, and that's what makes them grow. And this just shows you, this is a male flower that has already died and dropped off, and they're all over the place. And during the period when the male flowers they're called catkins, were in full bloom, the whole forest looked white. It looked like a sea when the wind blew, and when we used to have the American chestnut in great proliferation. But these are pure Americans, and the leaf is somewhat different. It shows very sharp,
let's take a
looks
look
like
at
spines, versus
the leaf.
The third back cross trees don't have exactly the same. We also have some pure Chinese trees in here. Again, these are control trees, and their leaf is even more different than the American chestnut leaf.
And the shape of the leaf will alter with each back cross?
Well, it becomes closer and closer to the pure American is what it does. And at 96% American, you'd probably had a very difficult time telling the difference between this leaf, for example, and the 4th back cross tree.
I see.
So, and we're, as I said, Pennsylvania is already in the 4th back cross and is now doing open forest planting. We're not quite there yet. I think we're going to probably do some open forest plantings next year.
Jim, how old are these trees here? When were these planted?
Well, the pure Americans that you see were planted in 2003 as kind of test trees to see if this particular parcel of land would allow them to grow. They don't do very well if the soil is wet or it's not acidic or it doesn't get a lot of sun. The balance of the trees in this orchard, and there's 165 of them left, were planted as nuts in 2004. We did it in April of 2004. I had a Cub Scout pack from Pepperell with my grandson, and we all came down here one day and put them in.
And where did you acquire the nuts from?
Well, the nuts came from controlled pollination of orchards in Andover, Mass, in Rhode Island, and I think it was either Upton or Uxbridge, where we actually had nuts. And again, the way we do that is we strip off all the leaves and all of the male flowers, and we take these little burrs, and we actually have pollen that is sent to us from the Virginia Meadowview Farm in Virginia, where all of the research on American chestnut goes. And we take that pollen, we put it on a glassine slide, and we rub the ends of these things.
I see.
And we put a bag around it, tie off the bag, so that when these burrs open, we know that we've got nuts that are pollinated basically from pollen that we know the progeny of, and trees that we know the progeny of. So we know precisely what we have in that bag. Unfortunately, squirrels discovered there's nuts in bags, and we have to be very careful that the nuts don't.
So those bags you put around all have to be labeled as part of the control methodology?
There's a whole, what you do is you write down the tree, the progeny of the tree, the date it was pollinated. There's a whole range of things that you fill out on each of this.
I see.
And we'll bag oh golly, this tree would probably have 20 or 30 bags on the ends of it.
I see.
And the goal is to get those nuts, and then they go into seed orchards, and the seed orchards with the fourth back cross are the ones that go into the open forest plantings.
Is there any consideration for seeds that are used or nuts that are used from, say, Massachusetts being used in Virginia or other climates?
Well, they did send nuts down to Virginia to be raised down there, and you have to keep in mind that the chestnut range from Maine to Alabama sees a whole host of different weather climate, and what you don't want to do is plant a Maine tree in Georgia, because it's not going to handle the heat.
Yeah,
and a Georgia tree in Maine is not going to make it in the winter.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of care taken in making sure that what we do up here, we're using nuts that are indigenous to the area.
I see.
So they can tolerate the weather.
I see. Now, that being said, were there ever any subspecies of American chestnuts? You know, if you had some in Maine and those nuts didn't work good in Georgia, were there ever any subspecies determined?
I'm not aware of any, frankly. Again, the state that had the greatest volume and amount of chestnut trees was Pennsylvania, from one end to the other, literally.
Yeah, I saw that on the map. It was
just amazing. It was
state.
It was devastating when the blight came.
Yeah.
But to my knowledge, the majority of the work is done by the state chapters, uses local trees. And again, all over the forests of Massachusetts, in the forest are stump sprouts from the old chestnuts that died when the blight got them, but the stump sprouts come up. And you know, I can show you later on where stump sprouts are coming up with these trees.
Yeah.
And they do have the blight, unfortunately. So.
Yeah.
I want to show you, Bill, what the blight looks like and what it does to the tree.
Okay.
And here's an example of, and this happens to be a third backcross tree that is not going to be used for anything. Get your fingers away from there. Don't touch that stuff. But you can see they look like orange pustules is the best way to describe them. And what they do is they form underneath the bark and gradually destroy or girdle the tree. And this is a pretty virulent issue if you look at it. And the tree will then start what we call root sprouts. And you can see there's some root sprouts that are already diseased.
Yes.
And others that are coming up. But this was a third backcross tree, planted as a nut in 2004. And we'll have to cut it down and basically scoop out the roots so it doesn't keep coming, because we know it's not going to survive the blight.
Yeah. Is the bark that has been lost here a result of the...
That's correct. Yeah.
I see.
And what it does basically is it grows underneath in the cambium layer, and it gradually that bark dies and then it just falls off.
I see.
The ones that we actually inoculate, the tree will heal itself around that.
Yeah.
What will happen is it'll open up as a patch of this orange stuff, and the tree will survive that, and that bark will fall off and it'll just be an open, but the tree will have closed around it in the sense that it's sealed itself off.
I see.
And those are the trees that we will pollinate for all the future back crosses that we want to do.
Yeah. Jim, can you talk about the inoculation process? How does that occur?
Yeah, what you do is you take a tree and you have a cork cutter, basically. It's a little round cutter. And you cut through to the cambium, to the hardwood, and you remove that. And then we have 2 petri dishes in which we're growing a very virulent strain of the blight and a less virulent. And we put 2 cuts in the tree with a cork cutter, and we actually take some of the petri dish and we put it in, we cover it with a piece of duct tape, and come back and see how the tree survived the following year.
I see.
So we've inoculated with a blight. Those trees that survive are the ones that become the mother trees for the restoration.
So what's the thinking behind using a very virulent form of the blight and one less?
Well, a virulent form is obviously the one that you really want to work against, but it's a kind of a control thing is what it is. And I'm not enough of a scientist to know why, but I know that we do the 2 strains of the blight. And again, this stuff it goes through the air, it's carried on birds' feet, it's sticky, it spreads, and every time there's a break, for example, this branch is rubbing against that branch, there's a break in the bark.
Yes, I see.
That's the likely place that the disease will strike.
I see. So a bird landing on a tree, picking it up on the feet.
To the next tree.
Yep. So very hard to control.
It is. It's one of the unfortunate things about it, and it's a reason, frankly, that once it started, they couldn't stop it.
Yeah, I can understand.
They tried cutting down, burning, you name it. Big swaths of the chestnut forest. It jumped them all.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Now, this is which cross?
This is a third back cross. This was planted as a nut in 2004.
Okay.
It's in the wet end of the orchard, so it never got to be as big as some of the other trees.
So the shape of this leaf, while the shape is the same, the edges of the leaf are a little bit
not as sharp as the ends of a pure American.
Right.
And ultimately, when we get to the 4th back cross, this leaf for the 4th back cross will look very similar to the pure American. There'll be very little difference. You really need to be pretty professional to figure out that it's a restoration chestnut instead of a pure American chestnut.
I see. Are there other characteristics other than the shape of the leaf?
Not really. Once we get to the 4th back cross, the nuts look identical.
I see.
The early back cross, when you had the Chinese dominant, the nuts are much larger than the American chestnut nuts.
I see. Jim, this is a fascinating place that's clearly a labor of love and takes some time
to
see the fruits of your labor. Let's go back to the studio and talk some more.
Okay.
Great.
Looking forward to it.
Can you describe to our viewers whereabouts on the Prouty estate this project is?
Sure. If you drive into the Prouty, you go past the fire station, and the Prouty house is on the right. Just continue up to where the barn is and park, and if you look into the field, you'll see the plantation.
Okay.
The orchard, actually.
And I know that there's signage there.
Yep.
That describes the project.
A little bit outdated, but yes.
Well, you know.
10 years old.
It certainly marks things. Well, Jim, I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge of trees in general, and specifically the American chestnut tree. It's an incredibly interesting topic. I want to thank you, viewers, for joining us, and we encourage you to learn more about the American chestnut tree by taking a walk to Prouty Woods. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Thank you, Bill. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
This was great. Yeah.